Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now we are happy to continue a conversation on healing through and past grief with CEO of CS Grief Counseling Services, Ceirid Sampson. Greetings, Ceirid. Thank you so much for making the time again. Now, when we last spoke, we focused a great deal on the individual journeying through grief. Now, I want to throw the net a bit wider to include social connections with the question, how can grief affect the circle around a grieving individual?
Okay, yes, and pleasant good afternoon again, and thanks you for allowing me this opportunity. I want to step back a bit before I answer that question. As we were speaking yesterday, as it relates to grief, I want us to just focus on, as you speak of the social aspect, I want us to just focus a bit on the depression of grief. I'll tell you why. Reason being, someone in depression affects their social environment. How does that happen? In them not being able to speak to, relate to, be part of that social environment. So depression and anxiety are the two most important things relative to grief as it relates to how the society is impacted. Right? So having said that, if someone is in a social setting and they're not able to be part of what is happening, whether it be by body language or their inability to be present. And when I say inability to be present, you talked about someone maybe having anxiety and trying to stand still in that environment where something is being said or someone is discussing something makes it very difficult for them. So in terms of the social setting, it is a very uncomfortable place for someone who is experiencing that level of loss.
And looking at the fact, and so once again, we asked about that social circle. So there's the individual who's not necessarily able to fit in that much because they're suffering
Correct.
anxiety or they have regret, they have their failed move looking forward. But the circle of that individual, what are some of the ways that a grieving individual can affect their circle, the people around them, their loved ones?
They too are uncomfortable. The persons who are around them, they are uncomfortable. They are, so I wonder if I talk about this topic, how is it going to affect them? So in everything that their social being tries to involve them in, they have to be walking on ice. Because if I talk about a scent of a cologne that I like, it may also be the cologne that the person who passed would have worn, and therefore it triggers. And when you're trying to be sociable and going through a grieving process, it's the triggers that cause you to be unsociable, and then allows even the persons who are around you to feel that uncomfortable. So what do we do with you? Do we not even invite you out? Do we not have you in our presence? And then they become a disadvantage.
All right, thank you. And I like the fact that you stepped back to come forward and answer the question, and I want to do that as well, please. In the sense that, is grief counseling a big thing? As in, is it prevalent? Now, I can't speak to hearing about a great number of individuals here in Trinidad and Tobago who offer grief counseling services.
And definitely so. And we don't even know what grief is. I'll be honest. We, having lost a loved one, having ended a relationship, our parents tell us, oh, you're going through a little tobacco, you will get over it. So we don't even know what we are going through in terms of those emotions. So grief is real. Those emotions that you go through are real. How many grief counselors there are? I can probably count them on one hand, if so many. And you find within our society, and I'm talking maybe even in terms of statistics, you find what happens is that our environment is one that focuses on grief as it relates to death and not loss. So we would have a lot of statistics about persons who died from suicide and persons who died from drowning, that sort of thing. But how were they affected? One, to commit that act, and two, to for the persons who are left behind, how are they affected in terms of coping?
Understood. And I appreciate the fact that you once again raised the issue that grief is not specifically relative to to losing a loved one, to the passing of an individual, and also tying that with the instances of wondering whether or not this will be a trigger or whether or not that will be a trigger. We need to walk on eggshells around this person. If someone is in a workplace and suffering grief, how do you interact with individuals? Because it's not necessarily a matter of, okay, social events, so we can have this person come, we can send them an invitation or not send them an invitation. We see them on a daily basis. How do we interact with that individual like that?
So, I call it holding hands. You can do one out of two things. You can just ignore them, or you can really try to assist that person in what they're going through. So a simple question like, how are you today? It may cause two reactions. I may become very overwhelmed, or I may become very welcoming. So you have to know how to approach that person. One thing that you should not say is that, oh gosh, you're there again today. What is it with you? When are you going to stop? So you got to be very empathetic as a grief counselor. That's one thing you need to be very empathetic, willing to listen. And even among your colleagues, for those who you see maybe experiencing some level of grief or some emotion that you are not familiar with them having, be a listening ear. We as Trinidadians will probably walk into the office and say, so what happened to you last night? And that may be the invitation that person wants to vent. So take that chance. It would not hurt. It would help.
I like the fact now that you call it a chance, though. But at the same time, we come back and because the same way it might be a positive, it might also be a little less so. But we continue the conversation when we return from this break. We're speaking with Ceirid Sampson, CEO of CS Grief Counselling Services. Stay with us. We return with more. Welcome back. We are looking at the journey passing through grief, healing through grief. We're doing so with CEO of CS Grief Counselling Services, Ceirid Sampson. And Ms. Sampson, grief counseling. We know there's a stigma that is being worked on at this point in time. But does an individual who is trying to approach you or approach an individual, I know you said you can count them on your hand for the most part, does that person suffer stigma, or does grief counseling suffer stigma similar to mental health? And can at times, and why you were happy, boy? Why you had nothing to sad for? Or that was so long you still crying for that? So I know people can put on a brave face or might withdraw, so people don't even comment on their face. But do you find the possibility of stigma arising for something like that?
Well, certainly, and you just raised the hornet's nest there. When you talk about stigma relative to grief, let's talk about the persons who are differently abled. Let's talk about the persons, the LGBTQ community. Let's talk about persons who have a hearing disability. Stigma. We talk about the guys not willing to cry because that's not what the environment in which they were brought up in, a stigma. So yes, there is a stigma attached to grief. Yes, there's a stigma attached to even coming out and saying, oh my God, I need help. Again, because of societal norms, men don't cry. Men are supposed to be able to handle this. And yes, we make choices in life that, we have to be able to cope with. But even in making those choices, we go through a process of emotions. Why am I this way? Why did it have to happen to me? Where's the guilt in it? What did my parents do to cause me to be this way? So that stigma is real. And so often people don't tend to see how important this is in terms of coping, in terms of addressing, and in terms of coping with that stigma.
And in terms of coping, what about some of those instances, possibly outside of Trinidad and Tobago, other cultures, where there is a ritualized grieving process that possibly would help facilitate an individual through the stages of grief? Do you think there is a space for that here, or is that something that you see existing here at all?
I think our culture is one in which we talk grief therapy, we talk, doing things like yoga, we speak to all those things, but like I said yesterday, you could lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. So if I am in a place where I don't really understand what you're trying to tell me here, and you don't understand my grief, even that yoga is going to become naught. And is it needed in our society? And as we spoke earlier yesterday, the kids in school, because we're talking loss not just by death, the kids in school who are going through being tormented by a classmate or bullied by a classmate, they remain with a stigma. I remember, I remember going to school, and people saying, "Oh, you would amount to nothing," and that remains there with you. Some of us tend to want to prove them wrong, and some of us say, "Okay, if that's what you say I am, that's what I'll continue to be."
And what you're saying is very interesting to me because it reminds me of the premise of original pain therapy, in the sense that yes, we're functioning individuals until there's some moment, triggering trauma that you develop a coping mechanism for. And if you are not able to recognize, articulate, and say, okay, well, this is what this is at this point in time, and able to deal and treat with it different, you find yourself repeating habits until, well,
Yeah.
ad nauseum, because until the
Yeah,
lesson is
so
learned, it will be taught.
a coping mechanism for grief would be alcohol. Choice. A coping mechanism for grief could be sexuality. Again, a choice. And if we are looking at the positive and not the negative aspects of coping, then you need to get help. Then you need to sit down with someone who can listen, someone who is willing to take you through that journey and understand not so much where you want to go, but where you're coming from.
And is there I don't want to say a statute or a set of ideal circumstances for someone to approach a professional to deal with their grief, and especially if they cannot manage it, if they find they can't manage it by themselves, but they realize to themselves, I need help, and I'm trying to find help.
What you find happening more often than not is that a lot of persons who are in need of counseling, um, it is done through a friend. I am seeing my friend struggling and I'm reaching out to you to help. Very rarely does that person ever come forth and admit, I need help. But I tell you, once they're in your presence, it's like, God, why didn't I do this before? Because this is so welcoming. Let me give you a for example. So a young lady, self-harming, suicidal, and not even knowing that she is going through some sort of mental disturbance. But a friend sees it and says, I think I need for you to talk to someone. And in her whole experience, in all the emotions that she's gone through, that is the first time anybody has said, I see you. And that is what people who are grieving need to hear. I see you. So often we don't see them. And we think the homeless, we think of the homeless as being depressed and they too are going through their own journey in terms of grief. There is something that was taken away from them for them to be where they are. I could go on and on.
But in terms of that person being seen or feeling seen, answer the person who says, I cannot give up my grief because that is my connection to that person or that thing that I love. And to lose that connection would be to lose a part of myself.
And that's a journey. And we have to allow those persons to go through that journey. So you can't stop that person and tell them, no, you can't continue to live your life like that. And even if you choose those words, you have to know when to say it. Because that is their comfort until they realize, hey, 3 days now, I have not even thought of that person. What is happening to me? And they themselves realize, hey, I am on the path of healing.
Now, there's so many nuances in what you're saying, because having someone be empathetic, willing to listen to an individual, even having that person willing to look at themselves, possibly in a slightly different frame of mind. You speak about yoga, and I think of the differences in yoga where there's some sequences that flow from one to the other. There's some where you just hold a position, and in holding that position for 2 or 3 minutes, it allows the mind to go so many different places if you let it. But are there any, I don't want to say like short-term measures, but surefire ways that in your experience have helped? Or is every single experience a unique one?
Yeah, grief is not short-term by any stretch of the imagination. Grief is all about when are you willing to say that I have grown from this position. Nobody can tell you when to stop grieving. I have known persons to sit at a dining room table for years because that's where their husband sat with them every night for years until they themselves decided to give up. So grief is it's a journey. I started by saying that it's a journey. It's not a place to stay. But who says how long that journey is going to be? I can't tell you it's time to stop thinking about your loved one. It's time to stop thinking about the job that you lost. It's time to move on from where you are. That's a decision you have to make. But I'm here to help you to realize that out of the experience that you've had, there is growth. And if you can realize how much you have grown since having experienced that loss, then you know that there's a future.
And there's a saying that a comfort place, a comfort area, or area of comfort may be nice, but nothing grows in that area. So we want to thank you so much, Ceirid Sampson, CEO of CS Grief Counselling, and letting us know that it's a journey. Some people may go direct, people may take the stops up maxi, but at the same time, it is a journey that we can grow through. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, I'm Dike. This has been In Depth. Thank you so much for joining us.